Good morning. I'm Mari Eggers from Montana State University. I'm an environmental health scientist. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here today to talk to all of you. And first of all, I'm just part of a really big team that conducted this study, and my key co-author, Adam Sigler, is over here in the audience. He is the Water Quality Extension Specialist for the state of Montana, and I would not have been able to do this work without him. The rest of our team, Nick Keekover is a grad student who's a stats whiz and R whiz. Paul Bradley and Kelly Smalling are the co-leads of the USGS National Environmental Health team, and we really followed their methodology in this study. They're part of the team. Al Parker is a statistician at MSU. Peterson is a risk assessment specialist. And finally, John LaFave has been the groundwater specialist for the state of Montana at the Montana Bureau of Mines and Geology for at least 25 years. So he's pretty much our state groundwater expert, and it was just a pleasure to work with this team. I think you all already know all of this, that about 15% of our population nationwide rely on home wells. In Montana, it's about 30%. So it's an especially serious issue for Montana. So here's our rationale, and for me this is personal. I want to give a little bit of background for how I got involved in this work. Many years ago, when I was first married, I followed my husband back to Montana, and we moved into what had been his grandparents' home on the Crow Reservation. And the home had been abandoned for a while, but luckily the power still worked, and we turned the power on. The well pump still worked. The water that came out of that kitchen tap was so awful tasting that we had to spit it out. Like I'd grown up on a home well. I'd never had well water that was that bad. And it was clear right away that we weren't going to drink or cook with this well water. We learned, we thought, well, we'll just call in Culligan, right? You know, they're going to solve this, and we're going to just install water treatment technology. Well, the Culligan guy said, well, you need a water softener, and then you need an iron manganese removal unit, and you need an RO unit. And we said, well, this is more than 30 years ago now. How much are those chemicals going to cost? And we know that getting some of those chemicals is going to be at least an hour drive away to Billings to even buy those chemicals. And he said, well, about $200 a month. We said, well, if we did all that and spent all that money, can we really still drink that water? And he said, well, actually, it is so hard. It's going to be really kind of brackish water, even after you treat it, and it's not going to taste great anyway. And we said, well, forget Culligan. We spent the next 13 years just hauling water for virtually everything except flushing the toilet in that house. We discovered that it was so high in total dissolved solids, we couldn't even shower in it. You know, we felt like we'd just gotten out of the ocean. You know, that kind of itchy feeling on your skin? That's what that water was like. I learned from trying to hand wash dishes in that water that all the cracks in my hands would get black. What's that? Manganese, yeah. There's really high manganese in it, among many other things. We were lucky. We were lucky that the water was so bad that we never even considered drinking and cooking with it. Lots of our neighbors on the reservation, you know, they may not make lemonade out of it, they might not drink it straight, but you know, you make strong enough coffee, it kind of covers over that kind of metallic taste. They cook, use stew, you put a lot of salt in your beef stew, and you know, you're good to go. Not that they like the taste, but they can't afford the water treatment technology. They just assume, well, it's bad tasting, but they don't know that it's bad for their health. So lots of people in the community are drinking and cooking with this water. And you might think, well, you know, if it's so high in manganese that it tastes metallic, people won't drink that water. Well, if they don't have an affordable alternative, they are still cooking it with it. So because I was teaching science at the local tribal college, people started coming around and talking to me about their concerns about water and health on the reservation. And, you know, people knew that their well water tasted awful, but no one kind of knew what was in it or why, or if that was associated with what seemed to be cancer clusters on the reservation. We were able to get funding and start testing it, and this map just shows this was an initial cumulative risk assessment just based on arsenic, nitrate, uranium, manganese, and we also checked for microbial contamination. With just those analytes, almost half the wells tested unsafe to drink for lifetime consumption. So this experience led to realizing that, it wasn't just the Crow Reservation that had this kind of poor quality groundwater. If you live in eastern Montana, you hear lots of stories about high manganese and high iron in well water and other, really hard water as well in parts of eastern Montana. So I realized, well, we had the statewide database, the Montana Groundwater Information Center, or GWIC database, that had well water from across the state, that we could analyze this data without having to get the money to test people's wells, but just analyze the existing data to do a statewide cumulative risk assessment. And Adam kindly agreed to jump into this endeavor with me. And we put together this team and we decided, well, we looked at this data, and first of all, it's a fairly old database. It was cutting edge when it was set up, maybe 50 some years ago, but the data needed a lot of cleaning to be able to analyze it. It was also, of course, it's a whole compilation of data from different labs in different years. Different people had decided to test for different analytes in their well water. So there's nothing at all consistent about the data from wells. So we could not do an analysis on a per well basis. Now, if you had unlimited resources, you could get 1,000 people across the state to go test their well water and analyze it all at the same lab for all the same 19 analytes, all the same methods, all the same reporting limits. And then you can analyze it by well. But we realized after talking with a statistician that we could calculate watershed level hazard quotients for these 19 analytes. And we use the HUC 8 level, Hydrologic Unit Code 8 watersheds. There are 98 of them across Montana, so that was our unit of analysis. And the next decision we made was that we were going to compare it, one, to just the EPA MCLs that apply to public water supplies, but then we also wanted to try out, and this is the methodology that the USGS has been piloting for the last, 6 or 7 years across the US, to use the health protective standards, use the EPA's MCLGs and health advisories. So those are standards that don't take into account the economy of public well water treatment. So they were strictly health-based standards. And so we decided we were also going to take a cumulative risk approach, again, following the USGS example. And we realized that one of our big challenges was how to handle all the non-detects and the variation in method detection limits over the years and across different labs. And from this, whatever R code we developed to do this analysis, we wanted to make publicly available so people in other states that had similar databases could follow this example. This is what our data look like. GWIC has data for more than 200,000 wells. Some of this is just location data, no water quality data. We're looking for wells that had at least one analyte with some detection above the detection limit. And also, really importantly, that we only analyze wells that were either clearly a home well for domestic use or was similarly in a shallow aquifer like a stock water well, that it would be representative of drinking water quality wells, home wells. This meant we eliminated petroleum wells, exploration wells. We eliminated monitoring wells that are around mining sites because that wasn't representative. So if you live close to a mining site, we're probably underestimating your risk from the state of Montana. So we were specifically looking at wells that represented water people was drinking. This got us down to about 6,500 wells and more than 84,000 data points across more than half of Montana's watersheds. Here's the two sets of health standards that we used. Well, this is the protective health standards we used. The next challenge was figuring out what to do with the non-detects. So for 9 analytes, more than 50% were non-detects. And of those 9 analytes, 5 of them, it was better than 80% non-detects. So you might hear people say, well, you should just use this NADA package, this non-detects and data analysis. It's a statistical method for estimating contaminant concentrations for non-detect values. But there's such high rates of non-detects, our statisticians that know we couldn't apply NADA. So the next question was, well, so how do we handle these? And again, we followed the USGS protocol, which was to take the lowest non-detect value for each of the contaminants in the data set and substitute in that value. So not half the non-detect level, but the lowest non-detect value in the data set. And this was really important because especially some of the older data, like the non-detect level for some of the older data for arsenic was 10 or more micrograms per liter. So way too high. So for most of the analytes, 16 out of 19, we could set the method detection limit to include that data and to include those non-detects at the same level as the health standard we were using, so we could accept all that data. But for 3 of them, arsenic, lead, and thallium, there were too many labs with higher level non-detects. More than 7% of the data we would have had to take out of the analysis altogether. And so this is where we used sensitivity analysis to figure out where was the best place to set that MDL cutoff to not eliminate too much data, which would skew the data towards just the detections, or include so much that, again, we're using too high-level MDLs. So we had a compromise for those 3 contaminants. That was probably the hardest part of this analysis to figure out. We used a fairly simple hazard quotient analysis. It's just the measured concentration divided by the health-based benchmark, and then summing those hazard quotients to determine the cumulative risk. So this is straightforward if you are just doing it on you have all 19 analytes for each well, and you can calculate a cumulative risk on a per well basis, but we couldn't do that because of the nature of this data. So what we determined was that we're going to do a cumulative risk assessment for on the HUC level, on the watershed level. So what we did is for the health protective standards, we took the median concentration of each analyte within that watershed and divided it by that health standard. So that's the hazard quotient 50. You'll see this in later slides. And we also, to kind of look at this distribution of the higher level, more contaminated wells, we also calculated this on the 75th percentile for each of the analytes in each of the watersheds. And we did one analysis with the health protective standards and one just applying the MCLs, because that's a traditional way that risk assessment is done for home well water. This is what we found. The top 2 maps are based on the protective health standards. The lower 2 maps are based on the MCLs. Everything that's yellow, orange, or red is considered unsafe for lifetime consumption, or just too high a risk for lifetime consumption. You can see just based on median values, this is the map in my upper left, your upper left. Just based on the median values of these contaminants, 75% of the watersheds, the median values calculate to unsafe for lifetime consumption. And the white watersheds are the ones where we lack the data to do this analysis. Whereas if you just apply the public water supply standards, you hardly see the risk across the state, and hardly at all on the median values. So it's really underestimates the risk by a magnitude. Here's another way of representing that same data. So in this case, we wanted to show which analytes were contributing how much to the data. So each of these stacked columns represents one watershed. You can see the numbers along the bottom are the numbers of the HUC 8 watersheds. The color represents the analytes, so you can see across the state, green is arsenic and pink is uranium, by far the 2 most common and most serious contaminants. That black line running horizontally is where the cumulative risk is 1.0. So the two graphs on the left are the ones based on the health protective standards, and you can see almost every bar is above that black line, exceeding acceptable risk for lifetime consumption. And on the right, you apply just the public water supply standards. You don't see nearly as many exceedances. Just another way we represented the data, we just wanted to look and see which analytes, how much risk each of these analytes is contributing across the state. Note that the scale on the left is a log scale, so there's a huge range of contaminant concentrations, from arsenic over, for most of these over multiple magnitudes. And you can see the arsenic and uranium alone in some wells are high enough to exceed a hazard quotient of 1.0. So exceeds the limit for lifetime consumption. And then having all these results, the next question is, well, how do we communicate these back to the state? And Adam Sigler has been running the Well-Educated program at MSU for the last 20 years. He's got a great website with lots of resources for well owners. And so he worked on posting these results on the Well-Educated website. So you can go to the Well-Educated website, you can go to a map of Montana, you can pull up your county. In this case, Gallatin County, this is where Bozeman is and MSU is. You can click on your county and you can look at that county map and say, all right, I see where I live, we're in the Madison watershed. And then down in the lower right, you can click on the link for Madison watershed, and what you get is your cumulative bar graph, your stack column graph that shows what are the risks in your watershed. If you're in Madison, by far away, arsenic is the main risk. That arsenic comes out of Yellowstone National Park, out of hot springs, down the rivers out of the park. And pink again, uranium is the second risk. But if you're a homeowner and you say, well, all right, I can afford to spend $200 on testing my well, what should I test for? Tell me what to test for. And so you can just go down this list, starting with 1, arsenic. You should definitely test for arsenic and uranium, and then you can work your way down this list from increasing to decreasing risk to see what you want to test your well for. And this is now up for every one of the 51 watersheds that we did this analysis for. The other thing that we're working on, and Adam is leading this, that a lot of you do, is kind of the community level clinics to encourage well testing, where people can bring their samples into the clinic for a certain drop-off date, and we send them away as a group and then host a community clinic afterwards to report the wells back. And I'm going to let Adam is going to talk more about the Well-Educated program in his lightning talk, so I will leave that to him. Another way we're displaying the data is for each of the contaminants, there's now a statewide map. You can see manganese is a huge issue in Montana, especially east of the divide in the eastern 2/3 of the state. We've learned that lithium is also a major concern. It's the concern is based on a Danish nationwide study that's showing higher lithium is associated with increased risk of autism spectrum disorder, of babies whose mothers were exposed to lithium in their drinking water during pregnancy. There's still that epi study hasn't been replicated yet, last I knew, and it's still debated, but it's definitely an emerging contaminant of concern, and it's a widespread issue in Montana. The other thing we're working on is just doing an extension publication, trying to communicate to people that these metals have lots of chronic health risks. We're just trying to compile from the literature. This is what I'm working on, is compiling the literature to show which chronic health risks are associated with which of these contaminants. And this is still a work in progress. We want this list to be at least the 19 contaminants that we tested for, as well as PFAS. I'm sure you see this. People say, well, my well water's fine. I'm not getting an upset stomach from it. They think, if I'm not getting diarrhea, then my water tastes fine, and it looks fine, it's clear, it's just good to go, right? They don't think, oh, funny, 4 out of 5 of my family members have diabetes. They don't know that there are a number of metals exposures that are associated with diabetes. They don't associate their well water with increased risk of a whole variety of chronic health conditions. So finally, in conclusion, we need to do far more well testing across Montana, especially in those watersheds where there's not currently enough data to do this analysis, and also to reach out to watersheds where we know now they're exceptionally high risks. We know that arsenic and uranium are the top 2 contaminants, and it's a serious environmental health issue for our state. We've learned that it's feasible to do this kind of analysis from this kind of incomplete and inconsistent data. It's far more cost-effective than starting from scratch with home well tests, and that you really have to use sensitivity analyses to figure out how to handle the diversity of method detection limits and non-detects. And finally, just thank you to our funders. This manuscript is published, it's accessible. There's a supplement to it with more graphs than you could ever possibly want to take a look at. And the R code is also available in HydroShare and very well annotated if you want to look at that and see if any of that's helpful to you. And these are some of the key references for the cumulative risk assessment methodology we used. And with that, I'll take questions.
Great. I'll pop up right here.
Okay.
Oh, I'm first.
Okay.
You want to read it? You want me to read it?
I can read it. Okay, I'm not sure. So MCLs are, yes, they're based on calculated risk, but it's also the cost of treatment for public water supplies. Does that directly relate to MCLGs? I'm not sure exactly what the question
So I
is.
asked a question.
Yeah.
And my point is that, like for arsenic, the goal is automatically set to 0 because
Right.
it causes cancer.
Right.
So how are you relating what a calculated risk is based on an MCL to something that's just automatically set to 0 and it hasn't had any science behind the value?
Well, there's a lot of science behind the MCLG being 0 for arsenic and lead. And
Okay. Anything that's a carcinogen, though, is just automatically set to 0, right? It's not evaluated like an MCL is. That's my question.
you know, practically speaking, because you can't divide by 0. So what the USGS does in its cumulative risk assessment methodology is set a very low value for the MCLGs for those that have in place of that 0, and we follow their lead in what they assess to be an appropriate health standard for the things that the MCLG is 0. But I think there's a lot of toxicology behind why carcinogens have an MCLG of 0, that there isn't any safe level of exposure for things like arsenic and lead. Is the community well testing funding covered by the state or the cost covered by the homeowner? So in Crow, we were able to get funding to do the community well testing because families just absolutely, by and large, couldn't afford it. And that was some EPA funding, some NIH funding. In the state of Montana, we're able to, the well-educated program has a reduced rate from the lab because of the volume of testing that they do, so they're able at least to offer somewhat reduced rate testing, but then the homeowner has to pay for that. Let's see. Tell us more about the USGS pilot to default to health-based standards. Okay. 84,000, that is all data that's already in the Montana Groundwater Information Center database. It's publicly available to the state. We were just using a public database, and our co-author, John Lefebvre, is kind of in charge of that database. So if we had questions about it or concerns about it, we were able to discuss it with him. But that's all that data is publicly available in the state of Montana. It's all online. Can you clarify if cumulative risk represents, okay. To default. I don't know whether more well protection groups are moving in the same direction. I'd love to hear that from the audience. This was the USGS decision because they felt that because the MCLs are also based on the cost of treatment, cost of arsenic removal, cost of uranium removal, those standards are set well above where we know that there are health risks. And they made the decision as the National Environmental Health Program for the USGS to use health-based standards, and they've done, 8 or 10 different studies around the country in different parts of the study, including one on Cape Cod, applying these standards, so they're comparable across different regions of the country. I'd really encourage you to look up Paul Bradley and Kelly Smalling's publications. And I don't know, is there anyone else here using the more health protective standards, or those of you who are doing this, are you using MCLs? Using health-based. And how did you come to that decision? Okay. All right, and where are you from? Oh, Chapel Hill. Awesome. And raise your hand. You're Minnesota is also using health-based. Okay. Anybody else? So I think this is a really good larger conversation. Yeah. So a hybrid version of it. All right. Well, this is a much larger conversation than we have time for right now. And do we have time for one last question? Or we? Yes. Okay. Yeah, so cumulative risk is looking at all those impacts on different body systems from different contaminants. So I guess you could say general negative health impact. It's just trying to say, you know, if you have a contaminant that's affecting your heart and, you know, or your livers or your kidneys, so you're not processing toxins as well, that's going to interact with the impacts of other toxins. Okay, I'm not a physician. I'm very well aware there's a physician here in the audience who could answer this question much better than me. But the general idea is, you know, it's all in your one body system, and this methodology assumes that the impact is additive. You know, it could be, that's a very simplified assumption, but it's better than ignoring the fact that there are cumulative impacts. So that's a very short answer to a very complicated question.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.